I only wanted shelter, but that old brass sorting wheel was hiding my family's past.
She was 24 and unpaid. No apartment, no final paycheck, no family room waiting, just her mother's brass letter opener and $43 she had hidden inside a flour tin. And with that money, she bought a condemned post office headquarters outside Omaha, Douglas County, Nebraska, a building that had fallen from route maps in 1971. The north wall had split above the lintel. Rain had rotted half the sorting floor. The county had closed it on March 12, 1998, and scheduled demolition for the first dry week of autumn. But inside the massive brass sorting wheel was a sealed chamber no inspector had opened in 86 years, holding money letters and a name Stella had never expected to see. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Stella Mercer had been decoding her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she read what others abandoned, rain-softened lists, labels peeled from medicine bottles, names penciled inside secondhand coats. She liked the pressure marks left after words were erased. By 10, she could tell whether a note had been written on a moving bus at a kitchen table or against a wall. Her mother, Evelyn, worked as a postal inspector and carried silence home like another piece of uniform. She taught Stella to hold damaged paper by its strongest edge, to look beneath stains before calling a word lost, and never to force certainty where evidence gave none. The gentler lessons came from Evelyn's father, Amos Bell, retired from the railway mail service. Every Saturday, Stella crossed town to his brick house where the basement smelled of paste and warm metal. Amos kept trays of dead letters beneath green-shaded lamps. Some were soaked, scorched, crushed, or written in hands that trembled beyond easy reading. He showed her how oblique light raised an erased address, how steam relaxed a folded corner without lifting ink, and how a town name might survive between 3 damaged letters. At noon, they ate tomato sandwiches over the sink, then returned to the table until the church clock struck 4. A letter is only dead when patience leaves it, he told her. He meant that ruin was not the same as ending. A careful person could still find direction in what looked spoiled, provided she did not hurry the evidence. Amos died during Stella's 19th winter. His trays, magnifiers, routing ledgers, and brass seals were supposed to pass to Evelyn, but a storage company cleared the basement after a missed payment. By the time Stella learned the tables were bare, Evelyn placed Amos's letter opener in her palm and closed her fingers around it. For 5 years, Stella worked accounts at Norway Freight Forms above a tire warehouse in Council Bluffs. The owner, Martin Vale, wore cuffs too white for the rooms he kept and lowered his voice whenever he lied. He counted pencils, locked the stationery cabinet, and made employees sign blank overtime sheets for efficiency. When payroll arrived late, he asked everyone to trust the quarter. By June, 3 months of wages were missing. On Monday, his desk was empty, the safe stood open, and every company account had been drained. Stella lasted 11 days after that. On July 18th, the landlord set her blue enamel wash basin outside first. It landed upside down and rolled once against the curb. Stella carried 2 boxes down while neighbors listened behind their doors. Her mother arrived in a county sedan, still wearing her badge. Stella asked for 1 week in the spare room. Evelyn looked toward the passenger window where her second husband waited with both hands on the wheel. She did not answer. The landlord lifted Stella's mattress by one stained corner. "Your things go out before the locks change." Stella folded Amos's letter opener into a dish towel, placed it beside the flour tin, and watched her mother's sedan leave without signaling. The first week she slept in the Council Bluffs bus depot until a guard recognized her coat. $39 remained. In Omaha, she spent 3 nights beneath a closed upholstery shop's awning, then 2 in a women's shelter where the fluorescent lights stayed on until midnight. $28 became $21 after laundry crackers and a bus ticket south. In Bellevue, she slept behind a church furnace room with permission from a caretaker who brought coffee in a chipped mug. By the 4th week, she had $12 and knew which library restroom opened earliest. She returned north on foot along industrial roads. One night, she slept inside an unlocked mail trailer near La Vista among canvas sacks smelling of dust and diesel. Another, she lay beneath a Papillion picnic shelter and held her shoes against her chest. At 6 weeks, the flour tin held $4.60, the brass opener, and a receipt for soup. On August 29, Stella entered the W. Dale Clark Library to dry her sleeves. She read the employment board, then the county notices, because Amos had taught her that unwanted things were often printed smaller. Near the bottom of a curled sheet, she found 4 lines: abandoned Federal Postal Annex, Douglas County disposal structure, as claim fee $400. Beneath it, someone had penciled deferred payment petition available for qualified custodial purchaser. She copied the parcel number onto her soup receipt and asked for maps showing the old transcontinental mail corridor. The building stood west of the river beyond a freight spur in a road used mostly by grain trucks. Its assessed value was nearly nothing. Its demolition cost was not. Stella sat until closing with the letter opener across her knees. Then she wrote a petition offering $4.60 as earnest money, her unpaid wage claim as collateral, and her labor as the only guarantee she possessed. At dawn, she boarded the first county bus, carrying one box, a folded blanket, and directions to a building the maps had stopped remembering. The county bus carried Stella west through morning traffic, past warehouse roofs and the broad commercial strips where Omaha thinned into fields. She rode to the final stop near Elkhorn, paid 35 cents from the flour tin, and walked 11 miles along West Center Road with her box against one hip. Wind pushed dry husks across the shoulder. By dusk, the soles of her shoes had opened at both toes. She slept that night in a hay barn 2 miles north of the road after asking permission from a farmer repairing a gate. The temperature fell to 38 degrees. Hay dust settled inside her collar and mice worked somewhere behind the stacked bales, but the roof held. Before sunrise, she wrapped twine around both shoes, thanked the farmer's empty kitchen window, and continued east toward the county offices. The old town center announced itself without ceremony. There was Muldoon Hardware beneath a striped awning, Havel's Cafe with 3 stools visible through steamed glass, Peterson Feed and Seed beside the tracks, the Bluebird Laundry with shirts turning slowly behind its windows, and Kruger Pharmacy, where a red clock hung above the door. Delivery trucks occupied most of the curb. Nobody seemed to notice a woman carrying everything she owned. The Douglas County Property Office occupied the second floor of a limestone annex behind the courthouse. Stella climbed 32 steps, rested once beneath a portrait of a former commissioner, and entered a room where deed books stood behind wire mesh doors. A ceiling fan moved warm paper air in patient circles. The clerk behind the counter had one silver eyebrow and a thumb stained purple by duplicating ink. Her brass nameplate read MRS, Inez Harrow Property Disposals. She examined Stella's petition, then Stella's shoes without changing expression. You understand the structure has been condemned. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county guarantees no water wiring, road access, or habitable room. Yes, ma'am. You understand all repairs, taxes, injuries, liens discovered after transfer, and demolition penalties become yours. Yes, ma'am. You understand the $400 balance remains due even if the building falls before winter. Stella rested Amos's letter opener beside the petition so the curled paper would lie flat. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Harrow drew the papers toward her. The county had accepted Stella's wage claim at a fraction of its face value after the state froze what remained of Norway's accounts. $4.60 would serve as consideration that morning. The remaining balance would be paid in monthly custodial installments with labor inspections credited against interest. Stella signed where the clerk tapped. Her legal name occupied more space than she expected, the middle name Bell narrow between Stella and Mercer. Mrs. Harrow stopped turning pages. Bell, she said. Was Amos Belkin to you? Stella looked up. My grandfather. The clerk removed her spectacles and held them by one temple. The silver eyebrow lifted. He brought damaged soldiers' mail here after the river flood of '52, worked 3 nights in the records room, would not leave until every envelope had a town attached to it. Stella had never heard the story. Amos had spoken about techniques, never victories. Mrs. Harrow opened a lower drawer and took out a photograph no larger than a postcard. 6 postal workers stood beside canvas sacks darkened by river water. Amos was at the edge, younger than Stella remembered him, holding a magnifying lens to the light. He said names deserved one honest search before being surrendered. Mrs. Harrow continued. When I saw your petition, I wondered whether Bell meant that Bell. She placed the photograph on the deed. Stella touched only its white border. Mrs. Harrow pressed the county seal into a brass stamp, rocked it once, and struck the deed with a heavy, exact sound. The embossed circle caught the light. West Center to 242nd, she said. North past the abandoned elevator. Take the gravel spur after the second culvert. When the road divides, keep beside the telegraph poles. The postal building is beyond the walnut stand. You cannot see it from the main road. The clerk folded the photograph into a plain envelope and handed it across the counter with the deed. That does not belong to the county anymore. Outside, Stella bought no food. She filled her bottle at the courthouse fountain and began walking before the heat settled between the buildings. Traffic faded after the grain elevator. The gravel spur ran beneath old telegraph poles whose wires had been removed, leaving glass insulators pale against the sky. At the second mile, a man in canvas overalls stood beside a mailbox shaped like a red barn. His black and white dog came down the ditch barking until Stella stopped. Easy, Otis, the man said. The dog circled her box, sniffed the blanket, and sat. You headed to the postal place. Stella nodded. The man studied the deed protruding from her coat pocket. Name's Walter Kessler. Southfield is mine. Dog thinks the Northfield is his. He pointed beyond a row of walnut trees whose leaves had begun to yellow. Keep left where the gravel disappears. Stone steps are hidden by sumac. Roof sheds slate when the wind turns. Do not stand under the east eave. Otis followed her for nearly a quarter mile before Walter whistled him back. The building emerged slowly behind the walnuts, first as a dark line beneath the branches, then as 3 stories of limestone and weathered brick. It was nearly 100 feet long and perhaps 60 feet across, with a loading wing extending toward the vanished railway siding. The hipped roof sagged near its eastern corner. 2 chimneys rose from the rear, one capped the other, split down its upper courses. Above the entrance, carved letters remained legible beneath lichen. United States Postal Route Headquarters, Omaha Division. One bronze door had been removed. Its replacement, a sheet of gray plywood hung from a chain, passed through the handles. Stella unlocked the county padlock, lifted the chain, and pushed. The plywood dragged across stone with a low complaint. Cold air touched her face. It smelled of limestone, dust, mouse nests, wet timber, and the mineral trace left by old ink. Sunlight entered through high windows and fell in separate squares across the front room. Endless wooden pigeonholes covered 2 walls, their labels curled but still readable: Kearney, North Platte, Cheyenne, Ogden. A rusted mail cart rested on its side, with one wheel spinning faintly after the door moved the air. Stella placed her box on a counter and listened. Water tapped somewhere behind the walls. A pigeon shifted overhead. Beneath those sounds lay the broad silence of a room built for hundreds of voices and left with none. She walked carefully, testing each board before trusting it. Grit pressed through the split soles of her shoes. On the central sorting table, her fingers found a skin of dust, soft as flour. When she wiped a narrow strip clean, the wood beneath was black walnut, scored by decades of canvas sacks and metal buckles. The back room opened beyond swinging doors, whose frosted glass had turned amber. Here the air tasted faintly of rust. Mail carts stood in rows beneath hanging route signs, and canvas bags lay collapsed along the wall like emptied coats. At the center of the room rose the sorting wheel. It was taller than Stella, a circular brass frame mounted upright on an iron axle. Hundreds of narrow slots radiated from its hub, each fitted with a tarnished label plate. A handle at shoulder height had once allowed a clerk to rotate the wheel and bring distant routes within reach. Green corrosion marked its lower rim. One section had been wrapped in oilcloth and secured with wire. Stella did not touch the wrapping. She chose the front room for the night because 3 windows still held glass. Using a rusted cart as a barricade, she pushed the plywood door closed and looped the chain from inside. She swept one rectangle of floor with a bundle of dry grass, spread her blanket beneath the sorting counter, and ate the final 2 crackers from her coat pocket. Darkness filled the pigeonholes first. Wind moved through the broken east windows and produced a thin note along the rim of the sorting wheel. Stella lay with the brass letter opener beneath her hand and Amos's photograph inside her coat. Near midnight, something small ran across the back room. The wheel answered with a single metallic click, then became still. Some letters waited because no one had been patient enough to read them. At first light, Stella followed the tapping behind the wall and found a hand pump in the loading yard, half hidden by burdock. Its handle resisted until she poured a spoonful of lamp oil into the joint and worked it 53 times. Rust-colored water came first, then water clear enough to fill her bottle after boiling. The outhouse stood beyond the northern walnuts, leaning but usable. She reset one loose floorboard with a stone and marked the safest path from the building with scraps of white cloth. Inside, she learned the post office by sound. The front hall creaked once near the door, twice beside the sorting counter, and gave a long warning groan 6 feet from the back room threshold. By the 3rd day, she could cross it before dawn without waking the pigeons. She also discovered that hunger made judgment careless. On the 4th morning, she walked to Muldoon Hardware, carrying a list written on the back of her county petition. The shop smelled of linseed oil, galvanized metal, and cedar shavings. Nails rested in wooden bins behind the counter. Stove pipe hung overhead in black sections. The owner was a broad man named Elias Muldoon, with the first joint missing from his left forefinger and a carpenter's pencil tucked behind one ear. He watched Stella examine 2 chimney brushes before asking where she lived. The postal headquarters. His pencil stopped moving. That roofless mausoleum beyond Kessler's Field. The roof is mostly present. Mostly is a dangerous measurement. She laid her list on the counter. Elias read it without smiling. "I have $4.25, she said. "I need enough to make 1 room safe and 1 stove draw." "That list costs more than your building. I can pay weekly when the state releases my wage claim. And if it does not, I work." He studied her hands, then opened a ledger bound in cracked brown cloth. "Name, Stella Mercer." He wrote it carefully. "Credit limit is $12. Miss 1 Saturday and it closes." "I understand." He placed a thin, grease-stained booklet on top of her purchases. Practical Repairs for Farm and Depot Buildings, 1936 edition. This is free because no sane person would buy it. She left with a wire chimney brush for $1.10, 15 feet of jointed rod for 90 cents, a flat pry bar for 75, a pound of 8-penny nails for 32, stove cement for 48, and a second-hand kerosene lantern for $1.60. Elias added 2 broken broom handles without entering them in the ledger. The western chimney served a pot-bellied stove in the former dispatch room. Stella removed the stovepipe one section at a time, carrying each piece outdoors before turning it so the soot would not spill across the floor. The elbow contained a mouse nest woven with postal twine. Above it, creosote had hardened into black scales nearly half an inch thick. She tied the chimney brush to the first rod, fed it upward, then added sections until the bristles met resistance near the second floor. The manual instructed her to work in short strokes, rotating clockwise to keep the threaded rods from loosening. She pushed 6 inches, withdrew 3, and turned. Creosote fell into a sheet of canvas beneath the flue with the sound of dry beans striking tin. At noon, the brush stopped completely. Stella climbed the interior service stairs, crossed a landing where plaster had fallen in broad shells, and opened a clean-out door behind the former telegraph room. A dead starling soot and part of a collapsed brick filled the bend. She removed them with the flat bar, and her bare hand wrapped in sacking. The work required 7 hours. She filled 2 buckets with creosote and swept the throat until bricks showed beneath the soot. Before replacing the pipe, she sealed each joint with stove cement and secured it with 3 screws salvaged from a mail cart. She waited until evening for the cement to skin over. The first fire began with walnut twigs, a strip of flour tin paper, and 1 shaving from a broken pigeonhole. Smoke rose through the pipe without entering the room. Stella held her hand near every joint, feeling for heat where none should escape. The draft strengthened and the stove made a small settling sound. She boiled water in an enamel cup Elias had included beneath the lantern. Into it she crumbled 2 crackers, half an onion given by Walter Kessler, and a pinch of salt saved in paper. The meal thickened into something between broth and paste. She ate it seated on an overturned mail sack frame, watching firelight move across the brass sorting wheel. Warmth changed the building's voice. Timbers released faint clicks. Metal expanded. Somewhere above, a pigeon rearranged itself with offended patience. The next morning, Stella began the workroom inventory. She chose only what might matter and left the rest undisturbed. On the west bench lay a glass inspection plate with one corner chipped, a hand lens in a leather sleeve, a brass postal scale balanced beneath dust, and a drying rack fitted with 20 narrow clips. A drawer contained powdered graphite gum Arabic and 6 camel hair brushes wrapped in newspaper dated 1920. Beneath the bench stood a steam kettle with a curved copper spout and a felt-covered press used to flatten water-damaged envelopes. The sorting wheel occupied the center of the room like an instrument whose music had been forgotten. Stella removed the oilcloth from its lower section by untwisting the securing wire rather than cutting it. The fabric had protected 3 root plates: Denver Night, Pacific Transfer, and Dead Letters Special Examination. The final plate sat over a slot wider than the others. She turned the wheel by its handle. It resisted, then moved 1/4 revolution with a low brass scrape. Each root compartment passed beneath her palm. Most answered a knuckle tap with the light, shallow sound of thin wood over empty space. The dead letter compartment answered differently. She tapped again. The sound was dull and short. Stella compared its weight by placing the wheel's handle level with her shoulder, releasing it, and observing how far the frame rotated under its own balance. The marked section descended every time. She removed 2 adjacent drawers and found their backs ended at the expected depth. The dead letter drawer stopped 3 inches sooner. There were no visible screws. Along the inner rim, beneath green corrosion, she found a cedar disc the size of a quarter pressed flush into the brass. A faint arrow had been cut across its grain. Amos had used similar discs to conceal the pins in his inspection box because cedar swelled less than pine when exposed to steam. Stella warmed the disc with a cloth dipped in hot water, waited 3 minutes, then pressed the arrow clockwise with the blunt end of the letter opener. The disc turned. A narrow brass pin withdrew from somewhere inside the wheel. She pulled the dead letter drawer. It came forward to its usual stop, then lowered a fraction under its own weight. Stella supported it with both hands and drew again. A false back slid free, releasing air that smelled of cedar cloth and old metal. Behind it were 4 packages. She carried them to the walnut sorting table and closed the curtains against direct sun. The first bundle was wrapped in waxed linen and tied with black thread. Inside lay Amos Bell's inspection lens, his bone folder, his ivory-handled ruling pen, and the narrow steel tweezers he had used to separate wet paper fibers. Stella recognized a crescent-shaped scorch on the lens frame from the Saturday he had leaned too close to a spirit lamp. She did not lift the second package until she had rewrapped the first. It contained materials sheets of Japanese tissue sticks of red sealing wax, powdered gum, linen thread, and 6 pieces of translucent mica for examining watermarks. Each had been protected by glassine folded with exact corners. The third package held a bundle of undelivered letters secured by faded blue ribbon. Their envelopes carried canceled stamps and root marks from 1919 and 1920. Several were addressed in damaged hands. One had stock certificate enclosed, written in pencil across the face. Stella placed the bundle beneath the inspection plate without opening it. The final object was a tin cash box. Its lock had already been broken, but the lid had been wired shut through both hasps. Stella untwisted the wire slowly. Inside were paper bank straps, cloth rolls, a small velvet case, and an envelope bearing her full middle name in Amos's handwriting. She counted the money twice. The cash totaled $79,843.70. Most lay in aged federal notes kept flat between blotting papers. The rolls contained $20 St. Gaudens pieces, $10 Indian head coins, Morgan silver dollars, and Barber half dollars. Each roll carried a date and a penciled number. The velvet case held a purple heart engraved on the reverse with Thomas E. Bell, 1944. Stella set it beside Amos's lens. The stock certificates remained inside the unopened letters. Their face values, printed companies, and signatures meant nothing without research, and the county deed did not answer whether undelivered property could pass with a building. The money itself might be abandoned, stolen, entrusted, or evidence of work someone had never completed. She refused to decide because the room was warm and her hands were shaking. The envelope addressed to her remained sealed. At dusk, she carried the letter, the medal, and Amos's lens outside, but left the cash box locked in the wheel. She walked beyond the walnut stand to a drainage pond fed by the old rail ditch. Wind moved the water in narrow bands. Geese crossed high above Omaha, their calls arriving after their bodies had passed. Stella sat on a limestone block until the cold entered her sleeves. She did not open the envelope. Some words deserved daylight, a cleared table, and hands that had stopped trembling. Behind her, the post office windows reflected the last pale strip of sky. The sorting wheel stood unseen inside, holding its emptied compartment open like a mouth that had finally released a name. Some letters waited because no one had been patient enough to read them. Morning entered through the high eastern windows and laid a pale bar across the sorting table. Stella washed her hands at the pump-heated water and cleared every tool from the walnut surface except Amos's lens and bone folder. When she turned the envelope beneath the light, she recognized the narrow upward stroke of his capitals and the pressure mark left by his damaged middle finger. She opened it along the seam. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have reached this letter, then the brass wheel has finally yielded to patience. I hope you opened it without force. The dead letter compartment was built to protect what could not safely travel and what could not yet be returned. I am writing from Omaha on October 16, 1987, after Dr. Miriam Hales at Clarkson Hospital told me that the weakness in my hands is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. She says the work will leave me before my mind does. I have therefore chosen to finish one route while I can still hold a pen. Our line in this trade began with Ada Bell, born in 1854 in St. Joseph, Missouri, who sorted river mail by lamplight. Her son Samuel Bell, born in 1878 in Omaha, entered the railway mail service in 1899. His daughter Ruth Bell, born in 1903 near Elkhorn, repaired flood-soaked envelopes and trained my hands when I was 12. I, Amos Samuel Bell, born in 1924 in Council Bluffs, carried their methods into the dead letter rooms. Your mother, Evelyn Bell Mercer, born in 1962 in Omaha, learned the law of the mails but would not keep the bench. You may be the fifth generation, or you may be a stranger with careful hands. Either is enough. The private examination room in this building closed on November 3, 1951. No official decoding work has been done here since that date. More than 36 years of silence have gathered in these drawers. My brother Thomas enlisted in 1942 and was killed in France during the Second World War. His Purple Heart came home without the last letter he wrote. I spent half my life searching for that envelope and the other half understanding that not every loss can be corrected. The medal belongs with the work because it taught me the limit of the work. Keep damaged paper below 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Steam from 12 inches away and never longer than 8 seconds at a time. Mix 1 part gum arabic with 4 parts distilled water for lifting loose fibers. Then wait 10 minutes before testing adhesion. Flatten damp envelopes between clean blotters under no more than 5 pounds for 24 hours. When ink has bled, read the surviving pressure first and the color second. The money came from storage fees, unclaimed postal settlements, and the lawful sale of abandoned route equipment over many years. The certificates inside the blue ribbon were never deliverable because every named recipient died without an heir we could verify. I recorded each search in the black ledger beneath the false floor of the inspection desk. Do not claim anything until you have read it. Inheritance is not what remains after a person stops working. It is the method left in another pair of hands: how to wait, how to test, how to admit when a name cannot be known. Use what is here carefully. Leave enough behind that the next patient person is not required to begin empty-handed. Behind the rear loading door, the third walnut from the stone drain bears Samuel's root mark. You will recognize it as a circle crossed by 2 horizontal lines. I left one further safeguard there, though I no longer remember whether I was protecting it from thieves or from my own uncertainty. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Amos Samuel Bell, Omaha, Nebraska, October 16, 1987. Stella read the letter twice. The second time she placed one fingertip beneath each line without touching the ink. Then she folded the sheets along their original creases, returned them to the envelope, and pressed the flap flat with Amos's bone folder. The rear loading door had swollen inside its frame. She worked the pry bar beneath its lower edge, lifted and pushed until flakes of gray paint fell around her shoes. Outside, the stone drain ran along the foundation toward the walnut stand. She counted from the doorway. The third tree carried no sign at eye level. Stella knelt and brushed moss from the trunk near the roots. Beneath it, cut shallowly into the bark and healed almost smooth, was a circle crossed by two horizontal lines. The same mark appeared on the brass postal scale and on the cedar disc inside the sorting wheel. She traced it once, then stopped. Whatever safeguard Amos had placed there could wait until the ground softened and she understood more. Back inside, she set the kerosene lantern on the inspection desk. Then she filled Amos's small spirit lamp, trimmed its cotton wick to 1/8 of an inch, and struck a match. The flame rose blue at its base and steady above it. For the first time since his basement had been emptied, one of his working lights burned beside his lens. The room did not become less ruined, it became usable. Walter Kessler had given her an onion without asking for its price. Mrs. Harrow had placed Amos's photograph inside an envelope and called it no longer the county's. Elias Muldoon had opened a credit ledger after looking at hands that held almost nothing. The farmer near West Center Road had pointed toward his barn and returned to repairing his gate, allowing dignity to remain where charity might have exposed it. Perhaps you remember a kindness that arrived in the same quiet way, small enough that the giver may have forgotten it. What was it, and what did it allow you to do when your own strength was nearly spent? Stella lowered the lamp and watched heat gather in the brass cap. She did not open the stock certificates or search beneath the inspection desk. There would be time for ledgers, laws, and names after sleep. That night, she spread her blanket beside the warm stove. Amos's lens bone folder, tweezers, and letter rested in a careful row near her shoulder, close enough to reach without rising. Snow arrived on December soon. 4 inches laid quietly across the loading yard and the eastern slope of the roof. Stella stood beneath the damaged eave with the repair manual open against her coat and read the roofing chapter 3 times, once for sequence, once for measurements, and once for every place a person could fall. The main roof measured 98 feet by 58, but only the eastern quarter required immediate stripping. She calculated 22 squares of shingles, 6 rolls of 15-pound felt, and 32 pounds of galvanized nails, allowing 10% for breakage and bad cuts. The numbers exceeded both her credit and her strength. Elias Muldoon listened without interruption, then disappeared into the back room of the hardware store. He returned carrying a roofing hatchet with a square pole and a worn leather grip. "My brother's," he said. "He has no further use for it." A second man stood near the stove, tall and narrow, with white hair pressed flat beneath a railway cap. His name was Silas Greer, and he had roofed barns, depots, and 2 church steeples before his knees persuaded him to stop. "I can pay after inspection," Stella said. Silas buttoned his coat. "Then you cannot pay me." He arrived the next morning with a coil of rope and refused the ladder until Stella braced its feet with stone. Together they removed loose slate, sistered the split rafter with a 12-foot length of straight-grained fir, and pulled the 2 boards together using carriage bolts and broad washers. Silas snapped a chalk line across the felt so each course would remain honest, even when the roof beneath it did not. He taught her to set each nail in 3 strokes, 1 to start, 1 to seat, 1 to finish, without bruising the shingle. On the 6th day, he pointed with the roofing hatchet. "That nail's proud." Stella reached for the hammer. "Pull it." They worked 11 days beneath skies the color of old pewter. Wind carried snow beneath their cuffs, and every evening Stella swept broken slate from the loading dock before darkness froze it in place. By December 14th, the eastern slope lay sealed beneath new shingles, its lines plain and deliberate against the older roof. Silas climbed down, tested the final ladder rung, and left without waiting for thanks. That night, snow slid from the repaired section in one unbroken sheet. No water entered the sorting room. January exposed the chimney more clearly than snow had. Bricks near the crown had begun to spall their fired surfaces, peeling away in thin red shells. Mortar beneath them powdered under Stella's thumb and fell into the yard like pale sand. She built a scaffold from mail platform timbers, tied it back through a second-floor opening, and removed only the bricks that moved under hand pressure. Elias supplied hydraulic lime and fire clay on credit. Stella mixed 3 parts screen sand, 1 part lime, and 1/2 part fire clay for the upper courses nearest the flue, adding water slowly until the mortar held a ridge without shining. The work consumed 3 weeks in temperatures that remained mostly between 22 and 28 degrees Fahrenheit. She warmed the bricks near the stove before carrying them outside so frozen masonry would not steal moisture from the joints. Every 15 minutes her bare hands went numb. Gloves made the pointing tool clumsy, so she worked without them, then climbed down and held her fingers around an enamel cup until they hurt enough to bend again. Silas returned once, looked upward, and said only, "Your joints are too full." Stella scraped them back to a shallow, weathered profile before the mortar set. She rebuilt the crown with a slight outward slope, repointed the upper 6 feet, and packed fire clay around the liner where the old seal had cracked. Damp burlap protected the new work from wind, and a lantern beneath an overturned wash tub kept the lowest joints above freezing at night. On January 29, she lit a test fire with 3 sheets of newspaper and dry walnut kindling. Smoke entered the throat, rose cleanly, and vanished above the roof without curling against the stone. Stella stood outside until the final gray thread disappeared into the winter sky. The front room floor was white pine, though years of soot and wet boots had hidden its grain. Hand-cut rose-head nails held the oldest planks, each head slightly different because each had been finished by a hammer rather than a machine. Stella rented a random orbit sander from Elias for $14 per day. He required payment in advance and gave her 2 cautions: keep the machine moving and never begin beside the wall where escape was narrow. She set every proud nail below the surface with a square punch, then made the first pass with 80 grit paper. Black dust filled the collection bag and still escaped through every seam in her scarf. The second pass at 120 grit uncovered pale arcs around the old sorting counters. The final pass at 220 softened the scratches without erasing the floor's years. She vacuumed twice, wiped the planks with mineral spirits, and applied the first oil coat with a folded cotton pad. The pine darkened immediately, moving from washed gold to dark honey. 2 more coats, each rubbed thin across the grain and finished with it, carried the color toward mahogany where the old boards had absorbed ink and smoke. She waited 48 hours for the final cure and crossed the room only on clean stocking feet. There was one morning when she did none of it. She had awakened with the sander's vibration still inside her wrists and found herself unable to close her right hand around the stove door. Instead of forcing it, she walked to the drainage pond. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, one leg folded, its patience so complete that the wind seemed to divide around it. Stella remained on the limestone block until noon. The bird struck once, lifted a silver fish, and flew toward the river. She returned to the post office only to feed the fire and cover the unfinished floor against dust. The next morning, her hand closed normally. 8 windows remained in the room she intended to use. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked from sash to sash. The 8th contained a wavy original pane dated 1788 in a small etched corner, apparently salvaged from an earlier Eastern post house and installed here when the headquarters was built. Stella preserved it exactly where she found it. She removed the damaged sashes one at a time and numbered each hinge stop and weight pocket in pencil. Old glazing came free beneath a warmed putty knife. For the replacement panes, she bedded the glass in a thin ribbon of DAP 33, pressed until the putty showed evenly beneath the edge, then set glazing points no farther than 8 inches apart. The outer bevel was drawn in one continuous stroke wherever her hand allowed it, with the corners mitered clean enough to shed rain. Several counterweight cords had rotted inside the pockets. Stella replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, passed each line over its pulley, and tied a figure-8 knot large enough to seat inside the iron weight without slipping. She tested every sash before reinstalling the stop, lifting it 6 inches 12, then fully open, listening for the quiet balance of equal weight. The 7th window required 3 attempts because the lower rail had twisted. She steamed it beneath damp cloth, clamped it against the sorting table overnight, and fitted the glass the following morning. On February 26, she set the final pane in the former inspection room. Outside, the walnut branches were still bare. As she tooled the last putty corner, a chickadee landed on the nearest branch, its feet scarcely bending the twig. It watched her through the new glass. Stella lowered the knife and remained still until the bird flew toward the loading yard. Then she closed the sash. The cotton cords whispered through the pulleys, the counterweights descended inside the wall, and the window settled without a rattle. Behind the stove, the surviving plaster was horsehair laid over hand-split oak lath. Stella's first patch cracked before breakfast. The second sagged from the wall in one damp sheet. The third held until the stove warmed, then opened along its edge like a dry riverbed. Elias brought an old paper bag from his storeroom, its bottom reinforced with twine. Inside was clean horsehair left from his father's repair work. Stella teased the fibers apart, soaked them, and folded them into lime plaster until no handful contained a knot. She dampened the exposed lath before each application. The scratch coat was pressed through the gaps and scored diagonally while soft. Over it, she laid a 3/8-inch brown coat leveled with a cedar rule, then left it undisturbed for 72 hours. The final coat measured barely 1/8 of an inch and required a steel trowel kept wet enough to move without polishing the surface shut. When the last patch began to pale, Stella placed her palm near it without touching. These patches will hold another 100 years. The sentence remained inside her. It needed no witness. Doris Havel began leaving paper bags beside the front door on Tuesdays. She was a square-built woman with a silver braid pinned around the back of her head and flour dust permanently settled in the lines of her knuckles. The bags held heel slices, boiled eggs, and once a wedge of apple cake wrapped in waxed paper. Stella carried the third bag to the cafe and placed 2 coins beside the register. Doris pushed them back with one finger. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." It was not a candle shop. "Then make something that burns slowly." She turned toward this griddle before Stella could refuse again. Caleb Kessler arrived on a red Schwinn bicycle during the first week of March. He was 16, all elbows and careful eyes, with a splitting maul balanced across his handlebars. Without introduction, he began reducing the fallen walnut limbs behind the loading dock into stove lengths. Stella brought out the credit ledger and asked his hourly rate. Caleb drove the maul into a round and left it standing upright. My mother said, "About your grandfather." He did not explain what his mother had said. He worked until the bicycle basket could hold no more kindling accepted water and rode home with the maul across his shoulders. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on his way to the small Lutheran church near the feed store. His black hat had faded brown along the brim, and he walked with one gloved hand tucked behind his back. He never entered unless invited. He tipped his hat toward whichever window held Stella and offered the same four-word prayer. "Keep these hands steady." Sometimes she heard him. Sometimes the glass swallowed the words. The gesture remained. Stella postponed the cellar until February 11th, when 3 dry days had lowered the seepage beneath the steps. The entrance lay behind a warped door near the old parcel room. 7 granite steps descended into darkness, each worn shallow at its center by boots that had stopped coming decades before. The floor measured 12 by 15 feet and was laid in fieldstone over packed earth. At its center rested a dressed granite slab, too regular to belong among the others. A circle crossed by 2 horizontal lines had been carved into one corner. Stella cleaned the mark with a brush but did not lift the stone. The slab was large enough to conceal a drain, a vault, or nothing worth damaging her back to prove. Amos had taught her that curiosity was not permission. Under the 3rd step, her fingers found a small oak box wedged between granite and wall. The lid had swollen shut. She carried it upstairs, warmed it beside the stove, and eased the seam apart with the bone folder. Inside lay a brass key and a tintype. The key's bow had been shaped like the dead letter root mark, a circle crossed by twin bars. Its shaft was long, the bit narrow and asymmetrical. The tintype showed a young woman standing outside the postal headquarters in the summer of 1903, before the loading wing was enlarged. She held a steam kettle in one hand and an inspection lens in the other. Her hair was parted plainly. Her mouth was unsmiling. Except for the clothes and the darker eyes, she had Stella's face. Scratched into the metal backing were the words, "Ruth Bell, daughter of Samuel, age 25, summer of 1903. Stella set the photograph beside Amos's portrait. The key went onto the mantel above the stove where the fire caught its edges each evening. She did not know what had opened. Snow retreated first from the stone loading yard, then from the ditch beside the vanished railway spur. The creek beyond Kessler's field ran loud with meltwater. Walnut catkins appeared like narrow green tassels against branches that had seemed dead a week earlier. Stella spent March reading the black ledger beneath the inspection desk. Amos had documented every fee settlement auction recipient search and transfer. Mrs. Harrow helped her submit the records to the county attorney. The old cash was declared lawful custodial property attached to the transferred contents. The certificates required separate review and remained unopened under seal. Stella decided not to begin full dead letter restoration that spring. Her hands were learning the building before they could carry the trade. She would spend $1 Barber half-dollar on blotting paper, gum Arabic, and damaged envelopes bought as scrap, then practice on samples no living person awaited. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Stella completed her first entrusted letter. It had arrived from a farm widow near North Platte inside 2 sheets of cardboard. Floodwater had erased half the address, fused the flap, and carried brown silt beneath the stamp. Stella humidified it above distilled water for 6 seconds at a time, lifted the loose fibers with diluted gum, and studied the pressure marks beneath oblique light. By evening, she recovered a surname, 3 root numbers, and the curve of a town beginning with M. She found the recipient in an old school directory. The restored envelope left Omaha inside a new protective sleeve carrying the original letter unopened. Stella charged only for postage and 1 hour of work. When the mail cart rolled away, she stood beneath the root sign until its sound vanished. The front hall had changed without becoming polished. Restored white pine floors carried the dark marks of sorting tables. The pigeonholes remained labeled with Western towns, though several now held blotters, route maps, and bundles of practice paper. The brass wheel turned smoothly on its iron axle. Stella kept the wall repairs visible as pale, honest shapes around the stove. In the inspection room, Amos's lamp stood beside Ruth's tintype. The Purple Heart remained in its velvet case beneath the glass plate. Nothing had been arranged to impress a visitor. Everything could still be used. The brass key waited on the mantel until the following spring. A storm split one of the old walnut's lower limbs and exposed a rectangular plate set deep within the trunk. Samuel's root mark had been cut into its face. The plate was green with age and its keyhole had filled with bark. Stella cleaned it with a dry brush. The cellar key entered without resistance. Behind the plate lay a narrow copper-lined hollow. Inside was a folded 48-star American flag protected by waxed cloth and a note written in Ruth Bell's hand on April 8, 1918 during the First World War. Ruth wrote that her younger brother Daniel had departed for France with a railway engineering unit. She had hidden the flag because their father could no longer bear to see it above the workbench after Thomas's enlistment telegram arrived. Names in the family had been reused, she explained, and grief sometimes traveled through generations under the same address. The note contained no prophecy and no money. Ruth asked only that whoever found it ere the flag on a dry day fold it correctly and remember that mail routes had carried both orders to war and letters home from it. Stella spread the flag across the restored sorting table. Doris held one end. Caleb, taller now and wearing his father's canvas coat, held the other. Reverend Boyd stood near the wheel with his hat against his chest. They folded it without ceremony and returned it to the copper hollow with Ruth's note inside a new acid-free sleeve. On June 6, 2025, Stella carried Thomas E. Bell's Purple Heart to the Omaha National Cemetery on the anniversary of the Normandy landings. County records had confirmed his service and death in France in 1944, though no local grave bore his name. She placed the medal beside the memorial wall for one quiet hour, then returned it to the inspection room before evening. The money in the tin box remained mostly untouched. One barber half-dollar purchased her first repair materials. A Morgan dollar paid the county recording fee for the contents ledger. 2 worn gold pieces funded chimney flashing and an archival cabinet after each had been appraised, documented, and legally sold. No fifth coin was spent. The remaining currency and coins were sealed in a new steel case behind the sorting wheel. Stella added copies of the county ruling Amos's ledger and her own inventory. On the envelope fixed to the case, she wrote 2 words. The next one. The stock certificates were less simple. Some companies had disappeared, others had merged repeatedly across a century. The county attorney found that their ownership could not pass merely because the envelopes had been abandoned. Stella left them sealed and established a continuing search file for the named families. The fortune suggested by the certificates remained paper possibility and somebody else's right. The headquarters reopened without a sign or announcement. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard. Damaged family letters carefully examined, no promises, asked for Stella at the old Postal Road. The first month brought 2 envelopes, the second brought 5. By autumn, more than 40 names rested on Stella's mailing list, though many belonged to people willing to wait until weather evidence and law allowed the work to proceed. She accepted one piece at a time. Some arrived burned along an edge. Others had crossed oceans in coat linings, survived flooded basements, or remained folded inside Bibles after everyone who understood them had died. Stella never called an unreadable word restored until 3 separate signs supported it. When the evidence failed, she wrote uncertain in pencil and returned the letter without invention. Caleb came back one October afternoon carrying a plank beneath his arm. He had planed it from walnut taken from the storm-broken limb and carved the old federal lettering by hand. The sign read, Bell Dead Letter Examination. Below it, on a narrower board attached with 2 brass screws he had carved. And daughters. Stella ran her thumb over the final S. There are no daughters, she said. Caleb leaned the sign against the sorting counter. He had grown into Walter's shoulders, but still lowered his eyes when kindness risked being noticed. Not yet, he answered. She paid him in cash earned from 3 completed examinations. He accepted because the work deserved payment and because refusing forever could become another kind of pride. They hung the sign inside rather than above the entrance. Outside the building remained the old postal headquarters stone, darkened by rain, root lettering, softened but legible. Inside, the walnut board faced the room where work had resumed. That winter, Stella began a letter of her own. She used Amos's ruling pen and paper cut to the size of his original sheets. She recorded the roof repairs, the county decision, each coin spent, and the location of every tool. She described the brass key, Ruth's flag, Thomas's medal, and the unopened certificates. She included no claim that the work would continue through blood. At the top of the first page, she wrote, My dear one, whoever you are. She explained that the building might someday belong to a stranger, a clerk, a child of no one named Bell, or a person who entered only because rain had made the road impossible. The method mattered more than the surname. Heat must remain below 120 degrees. Evidence must be marked separately from hope. Every damaged name deserved an honest search, but no name should be invented to soothe the searcher. She folded the letter along 3 exact creases. Some letters waited because no one had been patient enough to read them. Stella placed her envelope behind the cedar disc in the sorting wheel, not beside the money, but beside the tools. Then she rotated the wheel until Dead Letters Special Examination faced the inspection table. Outside, evening settled between the walnuts. A mail truck passed along West Center Road, too distant to see its engine rising and falling beyond the fields. Stella trimmed the lamp, covered the gum mixture, and closed the final ledger for the night. The post office headquarters waits. It has always waited. In Mrs. Harrow's desk, at the county annex, the first dollar bill from Stella's $4.60 payment remained beneath the brass stamp. The clerk had exchanged it before recording the fee, then kept the worn bill inside the drawer with Amos's photograph receipt. Its corner carried a faint flour stain. Mrs. Harrow never spent it.